welcome to our briefing on day 2 of the meeting on the protection of minors in the Church. I remind you that this briefing will last until 2:30 and that given the short time available, please, individual interviews will not be possible afterwards. I'm grateful to have here today several people who are so deeply engaged in the struggle against this shameful tragedy of abuse against minors. And so, thank you, Cardinal O'Malley, to be here. Thank you, Cardinal Subic. Thank you, Monsignor Scicluna. Thank you, Father Lombardi, and thank you, Dr. Ruffini. I don't want to spare any further time, but I would like to underline how the participants at the meeting with whom I have the opportunity to speak are grateful to the Holy Father for this event of effective synodality. And although the meeting, we know, is a short one, there is the conviction that the fruit will be long-lasting. Non perdo ulteriore tempo perché
I won't take any more of your time. I know it's very important for you to be able to ask questions, and I give the floor immediately to Father Federico Lombardi. Thank you. I will be very concise. I just want to say 3 things. First, I want to talk about the atmosphere and the meeting, and I see.
Moderatore, trovo molto serena, positiva, compresa della gravità del tema, della sua serietà, anche del dolore che comporta il senso di compassione nella partecipazione, ma con un atteggiamento estremamente positivo. Non sento tensioni nell'assemblea, sento un grande desiderio di riflettere insieme.
I feel that there is deep gratitude for the presence of the Pope who summoned the meeting and is accompanying it, and everyone is reflecting and praying and trying to better understand their responsibility. I need also to say that from the words I've heard in the questions or in the working groups, I can see that the meeting was useful and necessary. What the Pope was saying, we must encourage growth we need to raise awareness of this process, but this is something that needs to be built up continuously. So a very positive, a very constructive atmosphere, and this meeting is truly very useful. The second thing I wanted to say, I mentioned this morning, I don't know if someone has seen it, the live broadcast, but I was very happy to be able to bring the testimony of the attention towards this meeting on the part of the special representative of the Secretary of the United Nations for the fight against violence against minors, Mrs. Marta Maria Santos Pais. I think many of you saw her last week at the meeting at the Gregorian University. On that occasion too, I was able to talk to her about this meeting, and she was really deeply interested and very supportive. She wished to help, to support, in fact, and so she has we had asked for documentation on the UN reports on the fight against violence against minors, UN reports, UNICEF reports in particular. And this was one of the things that the Pope had asked me to circulate to all of you. So I can confirm that this ecclesial work, this commitment, is to be set within the framework of the international fight against violence against minors, and then there are sexual abuse is one of the most serious aspects, but not the only one. And so we can rely on the solidarity of those who work internationally on these matters, and we can also offer our contribution, our collaboration to one of the great struggles of mankind. We want to achieve zero violence on children. This is one of the objectives of global sustainable development. The third point I wanted to mention is that the reflection points proposed by the Pope yesterday at the end of his address, and they have been distributed, have been received with deep gratitude by all the participants, and they are a stimulus. They are reflection points in all the different working groups. So if many of these points have been considered, have been discussed in the development of guidelines by bishops' conferences, etc., but they are truly useful to the general discussion in supporting the work and the efforts to achieve a concrete commitment. So the Pope then has given us an additional contribution in helping us with our work over these few days. I now give the floor to the Prefect, Mr. Ruffini. I will just take a few minutes. I will try to describe very briefly yesterday and this morning's plenary assemblies and the topics discussed in the minor circles and in the times dedicated to questions and answers during the plenary assemblies. In the plenary meeting, the awareness of the need for procedures was discussed. There was a change, and in some countries in particular, some results have been achieved in the past 15 years. The fight against abuse does not cancel, but also rather enhances the work of those in the church to protect the children. The Church's best defense as an institution lies in its ability to take on responsibilities that result from it being a moral institution in a fragile society. Criticism of the Church is not necessarily the result of a negative prejudice, but rather often express the opposite. People indicate that expectations are high. There's nostalgia for a very strong and exemplary leadership. In those who criticize and in those who even attack, there is an appeal to be just and true. The need to work in collegiality and synodality in a universal church where no one can say, this doesn't concern me. Everyone needs to recognize that abuse is always a crime, whatever the culture of a country. The theme of synodality is being discussed on how to work in synodality in confronting this scourge, and the formation of seminarists. Sexuality cannot be a taboo, and as to collegiality and synodality, it has been said that no bishop can feel that they can face this problem on their own, and this not just in view of synodality, but in fact we all live in a global village. So you can't face things on your own, and the importance has been underlined to clarify with a handbook the procedures, the different competences of the bishop, the metropolitan, the Congregation of the Doctrine for the Faith. This in the plenary assembly in the minor circles. It has been underlined that one must always see things from the victim's standpoint. The victims are never to be seen as a threat to the church. It's a matter of also trying to help perpetrators. Perpetrators often were they themselves the victims of abuse when they were children, and this has created a circle that needs to be broken up. There is the need for appropriate formation for seminarists and priests, a vocation to give themselves, and it has been said that seminaries are at risk of being closed environments. The role of the lay has been discussed. The lay should not represent an exception and to be resorted to only in times of crisis. The proposal of creating a task force has been discussed, a task force that could help the smaller churches. It's a matter also of facilitating a culture of listening and to rid the church of the culture of silence. And at times there is abuse also in families. There are different cases or types of abuse. It's a matter of creating a culture of reporting, also by indicating persons of reference. It's a matter of not having seminarists who are maybe excluded from one place and accepted another place. According to some, it is a matter of considering also the way of presenting these matters, the relationship between the civil offence and offence under canon law, also the relationship between the trial and the media. Quite often the presumption of innocence is not considered by the media or in the media. Utmost clarity was underlined, the importance of this in considering abuse as an intolerable crime, the meaning of the expression zero tolerance and the relationship between zero tolerance and the proportional penalty, removal from public ministry for all those involved in sexual abuse on minors. It has been said that this meeting can initiate a process of purification. Thank you.
Share your impression on the first 2 days. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. Glad that there's so much interest on the part of the press. And in my way of thinking, there is no thing more urgent for the church to do than to come together and to be able to come up with a way to address what is the most important part of our mission at this moment in history, the protection of children, and to redress the crimes, the suffering, the betrayals on so many children and vulnerable adults. I'm very happy that this meeting has focused so much on victims, because I really believe that this is where church leadership has to begin to learn the seriousness of child abuse, the damage that is done, the havoc that is wreaked on people's lives. And in my own ministry, I think one of the most important aspects of it has been, as a bishop, is meeting with so many victims and survivors. And one of the preparations that bishops were asked to do to come to this meeting was to meet with survivors in their own dioceses, in their own countries. And I thought that is very, very important. And many bishops have never had that experience, and it certainly is a life-changing one. Our Holy Father realizes that in different parts of the world, the responses to sexual abuse and outreach to survivors varies very, very much. And so bringing the leadership of the church throughout the world here to be able to pray, reflect, and hopefully come up with some very concrete action plans is going to be very, very important for all of us. The themes today, beginning with collegiality, I think was such an important one because in the church, every diocese is headed by a bishop who's responsible for his local church. But at the same time, we participate in the responsibility for the universal church. And beyond just the theological meaning of being a bishop and being part of the College of Bishops, in our global village that is the world, we cannot fail to see how when something happens in one part of the world, it affects the entire world, and even in one country. And we have seen that when dreadful mistakes are being made by church leadership in one part of the world, or these terrible crimes are being exposed, even in places where the church has made a great effort to be faithful to her mission, people are re-victimized. Young people lose their confidence in the church. The people become upset, priests become demoralized. So it's not enough to just worry about your own bailiwick. We're in this together, and the message of Cardinal Gracious today, I think, was a very compelling one, that together we must help each other, support each other, to be able to make our church the very safest place possible for young people. And we know that there are many places where the church doesn't have resources, but hopefully we will be putting into place ways that we can share our experiences and our resources to help each other in the church. Cardinal Supic's talk today on synodality, to me, was particularly important, coming from the American church, where this whole area of accountability of bishops is front and center, and where we realize that although the charter has certainly made a huge difference in the way that the church responds to the sexual abuse crisis, that there were serious lacuna that need to be addressed urgently. And so Cardinal Supic's address today, I think, presented some very concrete ideas that hopefully will help us coming out of this conference to be able to address the whole area of episcopal responsibility in a way that involves lay people and restores confidence to our people, gives people a way of being able to report the negligence or the malfeasance of the bishop, and a clear path forward to resolve those problems. So I'm very encouraged by what I've seen, and the sharing among the bishops in our language groups has been most positive. I think people understand the seriousness of this, that the Holy Father would bring together all the heads of bishops' conferences, and people really want to come up with concrete ideas that can be implemented throughout the world.
Thank you, Cardinal O'Malley. Cardinal Subic, you have the floor. Yep. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for covering this very important meeting that we have here in Rome. And I want to echo the sentiments of Cardinal O'Malley with regard to the fact that We're really here because of the witness, the courage, candor of victim survivors. I've always found that to be the case, that the meetings with them really keep us focused and provide us with ongoing learning. I've said before, when you have listened to one victim survivor, you have listened to one victim survivor, because their stories are all very unique. I think that's been very important as we see an organic development in these 3 days on the theme of ownership. We have to come to an ownership that I am responsible individually as a bishop. That's what we considered yesterday. But also that we are together as a college of bishops responsible too, because as Cardinal Melli just said, what happens in one place happens to us all. And we have to care for all of the children of God. And then tomorrow we'll take up how we are responsible together as a church, and that's why transparency is important. Transparency is about that ongoing communication to make sure that everyone has a voice and is able to understand what's going on in a very transparent way. You've probably noticed that the talks have really dealt with not only vision, which is important because we need to remind ourselves who we are, but also strategy, that there are some strategic, tactical things that have to be done. The Holy Father's been very clear from the beginning with the organizing group. He said, I want concrete steps. I want to make sure there are concrete outcomes. And we're beginning to see that take shape. But again, we can pass as many laws as you want, but if there is no motivation, no real sense of ownership on the part of each bishop and Episcopal conferences together and the College of Bishops, then we're not going to get anywhere. So that is the driving force of this meeting, to make sure that we create that sense of ownership personally, together as bishops, but as a church. And that will give us a pathway, set us on a trajectory of doing things that are very strategic and very concrete.
Thank you, Cardinal Subic, and finally, Monsignor Scicluna, please. Thank you.
I would like to concentrate on two words which I think bring this morning's contribution in focus. There are technical words, but I think that we need to listen carefully to what they mean to us and should mean to general public as well. Cardinal Gracious, in his speech, talked about collegiality. What does that mean? For us bishops, it reminds us that our mission is not only to be stewards of a local community. We three are residential bishops, Boston, Chicago, and Malta. But we also have a calling to serve the universal church as bishops. We form part of a college, a team, a college of bishops, presided over in charity and jurisdiction by the Holy Father. And we have this mission to contribute to the well-being of the universal church, of the Catholic Church. So that means also being accountable not only to ourselves, to our consciences, but also to the college. I think that was the more important aspect brought forward by Cardinal Gracious. And it's a very important aspect of the motivation we need to get it right. And that's what Cardinal Cupic has just emphasized. Cardinal Cupic then talked about another concept, which is synodality, accountability within a context of a pilgrim church. I think this is something that needs to be emphasized, developed more profoundly in our lived out experience. We are accountable to our people, and we need to exercise our stewardship in this issue child protection and our own witness of an unblemished life within the context of a pilgrim church, of the community of the faithful. So participation of the laity in our discernment, in our structures of accountability is not an optional, it is not an appendix, it is not an extra, it is fundamental to the well-being but also to the being of the church. We need to walk together because we are on a pilgrimage together. That's why we are synodal. And I think what Cardinal Zupic then in the second part of his talk, after giving us 4 principles for good governance on this aspect, proposing something concrete, talking about accountability of bishops for their own misconduct and for the way they tackle cases of sexual abuse, is an important proposal that needs to be studied, brought forward. But one of the more important aspects that remains with me is that there is space, and not only space, but also a role, an important role, I would call it an essential role, for lay, not only participation, I would say, not only expertise, but participation. If we're going to be together, we need to walk together, and we need to be together when it comes to having structures of accountability. Now, when it comes to bishops, we realize that the Supreme Pontiff, the Pope, has a special jurisdiction over bishops that has to be respected, because that is also part of the essence of being church, especially being a Roman Catholic Church, but it is within the context of communion that we have to live accountability. That is what I bring from today's meeting.
Thank you, Monsieur Scigluna. We're now open to questions, and please, brief questions due to the limited amount of time, and please, one question each of you, no cluster questions, because yesterday we had someone asking 3-4 questions. And please state your name and your media you represent and to whom you are addressing your question. Genoa? Jean-Marie Genoa.
Grazie.
From the Figaro. We talk about the legal responsibility of a bishop who has covered up sexual abuse. We have 3 very significant facts. When we came back from Ireland, the Pope said that a tribunal for the bishops in the Vatican is not possible. And then Cardinal Zupic this morning explained in the second part of his address, he said that it's very difficult, legally speaking, of a decentralization of this process. And then there's number 7 in yesterday's list that refers not to trying the bishops, but rather managing their problem. Why is everything so difficult? Is there some internal resistance? Are we talking about the statute of the bishops? And why, after the motu proprio of 3 years ago, how many bishops have been tried or involved? There seems to be a sort of resistance, and I'd like to understand why. And a short question. It's surprising that before such an important meeting, the statistical data have not been made available, given that this is such a widespread problem.
È una domanda proprio tesi, no, insieme. Incominciamo dall'ultimo punto, perché è una domanda più che legittima. Le statistiche dove sono? Allora, io direi che
where are the statistics? I must say this is a legitimate question. Now, the matter lies with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I'm adjunct secretary. I'm not trying to hide behind anything. Maybe I could hide behind this monitor, but I've talked to the prefect, Cardinal Ladaria, about this matter. And there is a desire to work on this. Unfortunately, it's not ready yet, but we studied the individual cases, but we didn't stop and think, why don't we have an in-depth study to give information, but not just for us, for the number, how many cases, but as to the outcomes. We are unable to provide this information because it hasn't been done, but it will be done because it is essential also to us to understand exactly how cases have been handled, where there might be improvements, what are the geographical areas the most affected. There's information that can be collected. We have been working on these matters since 2001, and this is something that we will have to do, but it will be important to set all the data in context. Now, as to your interesting comment on the question of tribunals, proceedings, when I read As a Loving Mother, I saw, well, there's no tribunal here, but there's something that is broader, because a tribunal assumes a crime or a breach of a law, but As a Loving Mother looks at the objectiveness of being unable to do good, or the lack of a will to do good. It does not go into the reasons why, because to prove an offense, a crime, you need evidence or gross negligence. But those who report an objective fact, you don't have to prove all this, but nothing was done in this sense, and As a Loving Mother helps anyone who wants to report an objective fact, but these people are not required to prove malice. I am looking from the outside, in fact, but this is the logic I have identified. The objective situations, the possibility of removing a leadership that is not effective. And this is something that is done, and it is indicated in the Code Canons 1740 and 1741. There's a list of cases where a bishop can remove a parish priest, who is the shepherd of a flock, of a community, but those canons too do not consider malice, but just the objectiveness of the inability to govern, to be shepherds. The procedure in Like a Loving Mother seeks to look at this, to remove an ineffective leader without saying we will punish you because you're a bad person. You're simply incapable of performing this work. The criminal aspect is not excluded, but As a Loving Mother opens up to this possibility when the Pope calls for a commission of jurists to decide on what needs to be done. This, to me, is the advantage of the system chosen by Pope Francis, rather than just having a trial where anybody who makes a denunciation or a report has to prove it. But this is, you simply acknowledge this.
The procedure is in Mater Amorevolis. Right now, the Holy See is working on preparing clarification of the implementation of that, which will be coming out very soon, I'm guaranteed. But this morning, Cardinal Supic was particularly addressing the question of, how is the denuncia? How do you make the complaint about the bishop who has been covering up or negligent, and this is also where we need some very clear protocols, and certainly in the United States Bishops' Conference it's something that is uppermost in our minds right now. So.
Ines San Martin e poi Gasparroni.
Ines San Martin.
Crux. For your eminences, if I might, Cardinal O'Malley, you just mentioned that the protection of children is the priority of the Catholic Church today. Can we perhaps start talking about protection of children as the big, next big social issue for the Catholic Church?
I think the Church, by addressing the problem, is helping the broader society, but we certainly have to begin by putting our own house in order. Certainly the child protection policies that have been adopted in so many parts of the world have had a huge repercussion beyond the Church itself. And when you think in some countries where a huge percentage of children are in Catholic schools or in Catholic institutions, but even our experience in the States since the last 15 years since the Charter has been initiated is that many other churches and organizations have come to us and asked us to share with them of our experiences. And so I think we are truly making a contribution. The Holy Father asked that the UN document be distributed to all the bishops today. I mean, he's very aware of the fact that this is not just a church effort, but that we're part of the human family, and all of us are concerned about children, whether they're in our Catholic agencies and parishes and schools or not.
Okay. Gasparroni aveva già.
Grazie, sono Gasparroni del...
Thank you, Mr. Gasparroni from ANSA. I'd like to ask both Monsignor Scicluna and Cardinal O'Malley where we stand and what we can expect as to the obligation for bishops to report to the civil authorities, because there are some episcopal conferences that act differently. Some consider it an obligation and others do not. A bishop who does not report an abuse to the civil authorities, is this an omission that needs to be sanctioned and punished or not?
Civile, perché l'obbligo nasce dalla legge civile, o quello in inglese si chiama domestic law. Per cui, per esempio, io parlo della mia piccola nazione.
I'm just talking about my small nation. It depends on the country and on the civil law of each context. If there is an abuse in the context of the church, I have an obligation to report. In England, you have domestic law, which provides for this obligation. But as Maltese Church, we bishops and religious superiors, we have decided that in any case, the question of reporting to the civil authority is a priority. If an adult is involved, then we give them to church, because according to Maltese law there is this choice, but whatever they decide, they have our support. But however, there is an obligation. If I do not comply with this, I myself am committing an offense and I'm responsible for this decision that is not the right decision. Now, aside from this, much depends on the culture, but the indication that comes from the circular letter of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith of 2011 is to comply and abide by state law in relation to this obligation. This is a very clear indication, and it needs to be followed always.
In the United States, in our charter, we have committed to always report. there are 50 states, and each state has its own reporting laws. But we believe that there's a moral obligation to share this information with the civil authorities for the safety of children. And I think the terrible crisis that we have experienced in the United States is precisely because for so long these crimes were not being reported. So reporting, to me, is a big part of the way forward and for the protection of children. I think it is very, very important, and a commitment on the part of bishops' conferences to report it is very, very important.
Diane Montagna e poi Delia Gallagher. Diane Montagna, Gallagher.
Diane Montagna from LifeSite News. Archbishop Scicluna, yesterday, in response to Sandro Magister's question, you spoke about the need regarding homosexuality. You spoke about the need not to categorize or generalize about categories of persons. And certainly this is true. I don't think in anything that's happened here, anyone has suggested that people with homosexual tendencies equal people who are abusing, and that should be clear. Nonetheless, as we saw in the United States, much of the abuse came out of decades of a subculture of homosexuality and sins of sodomy, if we want to call that, in the seminaries. Now, fortunately, in the US, a lot of that has been cleaned up, and the seminaries are making good progress in that. But in other parts of the world, that's not the case. In Honduras last year, in July, we had 50 seminarians writing to their rector and to the bishops to clean up the seminary. So just to clarify, while we shouldn't generalize about categories of persons, do you think, and a wider question for the cardinals, do you all think that it's important to address this sort of sin among the clergy, which fosters cover-up?
So the simple question is yes, but this has nothing to do with sexual abuse of minors. I think you were very clear in your premise, and I'm very grateful for that. So the answer to the question is yes. You cannot not address misconduct of that nature, which is sinful. And we're talking about people in formation, but even
Diana,
trying to save life. But this is not about sexual abuse of minors.
No, please. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but please, I have to be strictly on this. One for each one, because, you know. So now is Delia. And please, brief questions if you want to have the
Delia
opportunity
Gallagher
to
from
ask.
CNN. Cardinal O'Malley, Cardinal Supich. In 2002, the U.S. cardinals, your brother cardinals, were over here under John Paul II. I was here, many of the people in this room were here, and the American people were watching on television. And at that time, the reassuring face of this crisis, that crisis and the continuing crisis, was Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. On Saturday, dismissed from the priesthood and was an abuser himself, talking about zero tolerance, talking about cover-up would never happen again in the United States. How do you, amongst yourselves, cardinals, how are you holding each other accountable outside of the norms now? And how do you ensure the American people that what happened with your brother cardinals in 2002 is now going to change? In other words, that they can believe what you're now saying. Thank you.
You want to start?
Well, the only thing that I can tell you, I wasn't, of course, there in 2002 as one of the cardinals. I think I'm the junior of all the cardinals in the United States, is that I and everyone else has to be held accountable, and I've always believed that. I think that I've lived my life in such a way that I take seriously my call to discipleship, my call, first of all, to be a baptized person before I'm ordained. So it's just a matter of, first of all, accountability on my part, that I'm going to live my life this way. and then to make sure that we are supportive of each other to live the gospel. So the situation of Theodore McCarrick is a very, very sad moment in history. It's a shameful moment, and yet at the same time, each one of us, it causes each one of us to make sure that we live our lives authentically before the people of God that we serve. That's where the accountability, it seems to me, has to start.
Okay, Winfield. Oh, sorry. Yep, sorry.
I would just say that, you know, I agree with Cardinal Supic. It's a very sad moment for all of us. We're talking today about collegiality, about our obligation to each other. I would hope that any bishop who is aware of this kind of misbehavior would certainly make that known to the Holy See, and not feel that in any way we should try and cover it up or turn a blind eye to it. This is, you know, the transparency is what the way forward is about. We really have to be able to confront our sinfulness and to deal with it, not to ignore it or sweep it under the carpet.
Okay. So, Winfield, the mic. And then Nicolas Senez. After Winfield, Senez.
Nicole Winfield from Associated Press. Cardinal Supic, can you tell us how the proposals that you articulated today, using the Metropolitan to report and investigate these allegations against a bishop, how that squares with the proposals that the USCCB was going to vote on in November and we gather is still working on?
Yes, I would say this. First of all, it's not that the Metropolitan does the reporting. There's a third party or independent a line, either by internet or a website or a phone, that would take these accusations and report it from the plan that I had, to the papal nuncio, if it's against a bishop, to the Metropolitan of the bishop, and then as well, my proposal would be also to a ex-lay expert who works on this in the Metropolitan See. My vision here does two things differently from what was proposed by the Committee from Canonical Affairs, the Bishops' Conference. Two major things. The first is that it is a more regional approach, and I feel that that's important simply because part of the follow-up is not just trying the case or doing the investigation, but offering pastoral care to the person who's been victimized. I think that's a very important part that has to be included. And the other is, by anchoring it with our own church structures already, there would be a obligatory participation in that. The Bishops' Conference proposal was voluntary. It was not obligatory. And I feel that we have to anchor it within our structure of accountability that's already in place, with the provision that it also, as I suggested strongly, includes the lay experts, so that we take advantage of the lay expertise, but we also show that we're transparent. So that would be in a nutshell the difference.
Ok, Nicolas Senez e poi Ann Thompson. Dopo Senez, Thompson.
Grazie, Nicolas Senez, La Croix. Ieri qui
Yesterday, Archbishop Coleridge talked about cultural diversity as one of the challenges of this meeting. And we see still bishops who do not appear to be aware of the severity or the urgency of the matter. Are you seeing in this meeting a change in mentality of these bishops? Do you see a change? Can you see it in the people in front of you? You see the change?
That the change has to begin, first of all, with me. I also have to grow and to learn. And I'm learning from the voices of the victims and the other participants who are part of the religious superiors as well, who are part of this. So I think all of us have to leave this meeting changed and different. And that would be my hope, that we're all going to invest in each other and say, we're going to learn from each other, learn from the victims, and go home in a way that's transformed. In conversations that I've had with people who come from different areas in the world, where, for instance, where human sexuality is not talked about the way it is in the Western world, in families and society, it's kind of like the era that I grew up in the 50s, where things were just not talked about. Well, there are places in the world where that is the culture today. And so it is not a matter of people not wanting to deal with with problems, but it's to do it within a culture that is not does not have the experience of talking about these very intimate personal issues in a public way. And I think that we have to be respectful of that and respectful of their concerns, but at the same time make sure that that does not allow for a justification of secrecy, and that there has to be a pathway for them to deal with problems in a very constructive way. And I see that willingness there. That's what gives me hope. So we have to make sure that we don't become imperialist here from the United States or from the Western world. We have to, this is what synodality is about. It's walking together with each other, but also maybe learning from their experience and their own culture that there are some things that we could improve on given the richness of their own culture. I hope that helps.
And Thompson?
Thank you. Ann Thompson from NBC News. Cardinal Cupich, under your proposal today, Theodore McCarrick would have been a metropolitan. Cardinal Law would have been a metropolitan. So how does that inspire confidence? And who in the world is going to police the metropolitans? Good
question, Ann. Thank you, and good to see you again. My proposal, you have to read the footnotes. I didn't want to get into the alternates, but there's a whole long paragraph about what you do if the metropolitan is accused. It could be a variety of things. Either it could be a local a regional metropolitan who would take it, or the bishops' conference would set up someone else to do it, or it could be the senior bishop in the province itself, a senior suffragan bishop. But there's a way to do that. What would be important, however, is to make sure that whoever the bishop is who handles it, that there is lay involvement as well for transparency. Because I think that makes it not only transparent, but it makes it church, where we're all in this together. And that was the argument that I tried to make today. So there is a pathway for that. There are alternatives for that. We have this in the court system. We have judges who recuse themselves in different cases. We have this in civil society. There's no reason why we can't benefit from that experience.
Rubin. Sergio Rubin.
Sí, Sergio Rubin de Todo Noticias Argentina. Ustedes han insistido mucho en la responsabilidad.
You have insisted at length on the responsibility of the bishops, on how to be vigilant in this regard, but in the past, there have been structural cover-ups that have reached up even to the Holy See. One case was mentioned that involved even Pope Ratzinger in looking at the past and looking at structural responsibility. Is this a closed matter, or is it going to be discussed again, or can the past be reviewed? For the time being, we haven't discussed this matter, but it is undoubtedly very important. It's quite clear, and we've said this, that to review the whole notion of papal secrecy is important. Transparency is fundamental if we are to tackle this problem. So not only at a country level, but also at the level of the Holy See.
Catholic reporter. My question is for Cardinal O'Malley. I wanted to ask about the 21 points the Pope delivered to you all yesterday. Some of the clergy abuse survivors here were a bit disappointed in those points. They said they saw them as a step backwards, particularly because they don't mention zero tolerance. I'm wondering, I know you've been in the aula, I don't know if you've seen this criticism, but I'm wondering if you might be able to respond to that and how you're considering these 21 points. What should we make of them?
Obviously, those 21 points are just sort of a point of departure, and I never interpreted that as going against zero tolerance. I know there's a lot of resistance to using that terminology that sounds secular, I don't know what, but the principle that was so clearly articulated by John Paul II, that there's no place in ministry for someone who harms a child, and that has to be a line in the sand. That's something that is so important for all of us. Oh yes, thank you. They reminded me, the Holy Father, when he gave us the 24 points, said these were points that were submitted by the bishops that he had compiled for. It wasn't coming from himself.
Okay, Rocca, please. We have last
Thank you,
questions.
Frank
Rocca and then Caricato. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Frank Rocca, Wall Street Journal. This is for both cardinals and for Archbishop Scicluna, if they all want to reply, because it's about the points that Josh was just talking about. Number 15 has given some of us a little bit, has confused some of us, or at least me. I'll read from the English translation, but it says, observe the traditional principle of proportionality of punishment with respect to the crime committed, period. And then it says, to decide that priests and bishops guilty of sexual abuse of minors leave the public ministry. Now, the second sentence in isolation, it's kind of awkward, at least in the English, but seems to be saying something like, anybody who is abused a child should be removed from ministry, which sounds like the one-strike rule we have in the United States and in a few other countries, but as we know, not in general. But paired with the first sentence, it's a bit confusing, because there seems to be a tension there, because proportionality is the principle invoked by people who say, well, now hold on, one size doesn't fit all, there has to be different penalties depending on the gravity of the offense and so forth. So how are we to read this, and how, may I ask, are the bishops reading this as a point of departure? Is this supposed to say, well, consider to what extent the principle of proportionality allows you to have that one-strike rule, or in deciding whether somebody should be removed from ministry, use proportionality, or what? Thanks.
Well, in the States, when we were discussing the charter, the commitment was no one could continue in ministry after having harmed a child. But the conclusion wasn't automatically that they would be laicized, and that if they were elderly and sickly, that they could have prayer and penance. And in some religious communities, it was decided that they thought it was better to maintain that person within the community to be able to monitor them for the safety of children. So it's not the same outcome, but the removal from ministry would be for all cases. That's yes, but I would advocate that for everywhere.
Okay, Caricato. Time is almost up. Then Caricato, and finally Pulella. Last question. Caricato, Cristiana Caricato, and Phil Pulella. The last question, please.
Torno sulla questione del.
I'll go back to the matter of zero tolerance. We've heard that it was mentioned and discussed in the working groups. Undoubtedly, in the last synod, in the latest synods, two persons had spoken against this notion. Is this a linguistic problem in relation to the imperialism mentioned by Supic, or is it a vision, on the one hand, a very firm approach, and on the other, a more theological, comprehensive approach to the problem?
C'è un principio che deve essere un po' l'anima di ogni decisione in questo campo, che sarebbe anche la.
There has to be a principle that is at the heart of all decision, and this is at the heart also of number 15. We cannot allow anyone in the ministry to hurt the young. But this is a principle that has nothing to do with the penalty. It's simply prudential, and it's an urgent measure, because at the start it refers to the proportionality of punishment. The second principle is a prudential principle. If you don't want to punish, but this person could harm, then they cannot be in the public ministry. For those who don't like the notion of zero tolerance, because they don't know exactly what this means, no one would dare say, but if there's somebody who might harm the young, I'll just leave him in his ministry. This is a principle already stated very clearly by John Paul II, 23rd April 2002, and this is what is to fuel every decision from the prudential and pastoral standpoint as a fundamental principle. If the person is removed from, or is to spend a life of prayer and repentance, but in any case, the prudential approach is not primarily a criminal approach. I'm not going to remove someone from ministry to punish them, but to protect the flock. And this is the more fundamental idea. Father Lombardi would like to add something. If I may, I'd just like to refer briefly to this question of zero tolerance. I've written 3 articles on this recently. I wrote very long articles, but I never used this definition, zero tolerance, if not in a note, to explain how this is explained correctly by the Canadian and American bishops. Why do I find it difficult to use the definition zero tolerance? Because it clearly refers to a very limited aspect of the problem we're confronting, the entire dimension of pastoral care for victims, accompaniment, the selection of members of the clergy, prevention in parishes and in our activities. The definition of zero tolerance does not cover these aspects. It refers to one way of a punitive action against criminal This is a very important, fundamental part, but it is one part of the entire area of protection of minors, which I think is much broader, and I think that at this meeting too, we're looking at it in a much broader context. So it's the adequacy of the words in helping us tackle the complexity and the breadth of these problems. If we talk about prevention in the digital world and all that, it would seem that it doesn't exist. Instead, it's very important. If then, as Cardinal O'Malley says, to the Americans or the Canadians, it means something very specific. Anybody who has committed a serious offense, they cannot remain in the ministry. Well, I agree, but when I talk about protection of minors, I'm talking about a lot of other things as well.
This is for the two American cardinals. This morning, Cardinal Gracious in his speech said, and I quote, "Do we really engage in an open conversation and point out honestly to our brother bishops or priests when we notice problematic behavior in them?" End quote. Can you tell me if you regret that more people in the U.S. hierarchy did not speak to Cardinal McCarrick, ex-Cardinal McCarrick, about his, quote, problematic behavior, even though we knew about it, a lot of people knew about it? And since the Vatican has decided, apparently, not to do an apostolic visitation, how is your own investigation in the conference going on who knew what, when, and do you expect the heads to roll?
I don't know that bishops did not speak to him about his proclivities or his activities. I kind of hope that they did, particularly people who may have been aware of this or heard it. But the investigations, I understand, are going forward, and hopefully we will get a report soon from the Holy See, the result of the Holy See's investigations and the investigations in the States.
Yes, I know there was a declaration from the Holy See about this, that they were going to go through the files and do an investigation. I don't know where that is. I do know that Cardinal Ouellet already made some declarations, or at least wrote letters where there is information there. I don't know of anything that the USCCB per se has undertaken.
The individual dioceses are have been involved in that, and the Holy See has been in contact with them, and I'm told that in the not too distant future there will be a report given that will take into account all of these things. Not the USCCB, the individual dioceses that are in communications with the Holy See on their own internal studies.
Thank you all. Thank you. And see you tomorrow at the same time for the briefing. Grazie a tutti.
A peace-loving nation founded on Catholic values. A nation built upon the faith of North American martyrs. Together with the Catholic Church, let's restore our values. Bring the abundance of life back to Canada. From conception to natural death. Shalom World joined hands with the Church, spreading the good news across Canada, from the shores of Newfoundland and Labrador on the Atlantic coast to the waves of the Pacific Ocean off British Columbia. O Canada, may He have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Experience the immense power of God's love, peace of Christ, through Shalom World TV, 24/7 high definition, commercial-free Catholic channel.
It's a way of life.
With vibrant programs catering to all age groups.
Communicate the truth of God's love and the gospel of our Lord.
Endorsed by cardinals and bishops.
Transmit the message of the good news and to invite people to know the living God.
Embraced by congregations, Shalom World pursues the dream of new evangelization. A new dawn in the media culture. Experience the anointing through Holy Mass, adoration, night vigil, Word of God,
a way to live,
talk shows, conferences, animations, documentaries, live papal visits, and much more. As the waves of new evangelization sweep across Canada,
Joyfully be.
Shalom World reaches out to every household, absolutely free, to share the peace of Christ using all modern means of communication. Rise up, join hands, and celebrate life with God's own channel. Change what you watch and watch the world change. Shalom World TV, God's own channel.
Why is making good choices so hard?